Manetti Shrem Museum. My name is Millen. I'm a Visitor Services student staffer here. And before we begin today's program, let's take a moment to acknowledge the land on which UC Davis sits. For thousands of years, this land has been the home of the Putwin people. Today, there are 3 federally recognized Putwin tribes: Kachil-Dihi Band of Wintun Indians of the Calusa Indian Community, Quetzal-Dihi Wintun Nation, and Yocha-Dihi Wintun Nation. The Putwin people have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries. It has been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations. We are honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands. Thank you.
Well, there are a few people here today, I guess. Welcome everybody to the 2026 Eugene Lun Memorial Lecture. Eugene Lun distinguished himself as a scholar in the field of modern European intellectual history. He was a passionate and productive researcher as well as an engaged and charismatic teacher. In his memory, a fund was assembled to support an annual lecture featuring notable scholars whose work reaches and inspires a broad public. This lecture series has become an important tradition at Davis, made possible by the generous donations of many in this room, and that room. We would like to thank the Lun family, Donna Reed and Rachel and Stephen Gadoff, our co-sponsors, the Davis Humanities Institute, UCD Global Affairs, Pi Sigma Alpha Delta Upsilon, Porter Creek Vineyards, and the UCD Human Rights Studies, as well as individual donors. We depend on your generosity to continue this series and are grateful for any contribution you can make. Many of you have flyers in which there's a QR code you can use to make a donation, or you could simply Google the UC Davis History Department or UC Davis History Department Lun Lecture, and there's a button for you right there. I'm delighted to welcome this year's lecturer, Anne Applebaum. She is a distinguished historian of Central and Eastern Europe, as well as one of the most prominent public intellectuals of our time. The title of her first book, Between East and West, Across the Borderlands of Europe, encapsulates her own productive border crossings between professional historian and engaged journalist. But Borderlands also connotes a liminal in-between state, a state that I do not associate with Anne Applebaum. Since the late 1980s, she has been unwavering in her support of democracy and prescient in her predictions of rising autocracy. So we will be illuminated this evening. I'm not doing this. All right. Darkness has descended. This is what we're talking about. All right. Special effects for this evening only. Her border crossings were evident as early as her undergraduate years at Yale, where she double majored in history and literature. She moved to England, studied at the London School of Economics and Oxford, and became a journalist and editor for several of the country's leading publications, including The Economist. Her reporting reached beyond the border of the English Channel to Central and Eastern Europe, where she wrote about the exhilarating fall of the Berlin Wall and the ominous rise to power of autocrats like Vladimir Putin. She said these were formative influences for her. She broadened her repertorial borders to encompass the past as well as the present by writing Gulag, A History, which won the 2004 Pulitzer Prize. Her other histories, Iron Curtain, The Crushing of Eastern Europe, 1944 to 1956, and Red Famine, Stalin's War in the Ukraine, also garnered several awards and wide attention. As a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins School of International Studies, she monitors the relative health of global democracies and tracks threats to them from internet disinformation campaigns. She also continues to alert the public about vital political issues. After 17 years as a columnist for the Washington Post, she became a staff writer for The Atlantic, where she also hosts a podcast called Autocracy in America. Her work there informs her recent bestsellers, Twilight of Democracy and Autocracy Inc, The Dictators Who Want to Rule the World, 2024. Defending democracy has not always been fashionable among progressives, but in today's exigent circumstances, many wonder whether it can be preserved And if so, what is to be done? Autocracy Inc. is dedicated, quote, to the optimists, unquote, but it's the pessimists who really need it. That's because the book concretely identifies who the autocrats are, how they operate, and what steps might be taken to diminish their financial power and deceptive narratives. Autocracy Inc. is a work of current affairs, but it could just as well be shelved under true crime or even self-help. Reading it, one traverses the border between anxious confusion and hopeful illumination. Please join me in welcoming Anne Applebaum.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm so flattered that so many of you found time to come. There is extra space for those who want to sit down. I've just been, you've just heard. If you can't stand that long in the back. I also want to particularly thank the History Department and Kathy Stewart and Mike Saylor for organizing this trip and my trip here and this event. As well as the family of Eugene Lun. I think it's great to have lectures in the tradition of a beloved professor. It allows the intellectual tradition to carry on. I have to say, when I was thinking about what to say here today, I started looking for a word or a phrase that I could use to describe this particular moment, and I didn't really find one. Is it a turning point? Is it a paradigm change? Is it a global shift? And then I started thinking about a famous or maybe even infamous literary history book called The Swerve. And this is a book about when Northern Europeans rediscovered ancient manuscripts, and this launched the Renaissance. And I actually feel that what we're living through now is a swerve in that sense. Of course, it's a different kind of swerve. What we're seeing is American and European politicians right now, knowingly and maybe even unknowingly, rediscovering ideas from the 1920s and 1930s. So whether it's the ideas of Carl Schmitt, the idea that all politics is about the creation of enemies and the manipulation of hatred, whether it's the idea that true leadership involves breaking the rules of the state and using emergency powers to redefine what the state is, whether it's an old new definition of sovereignty, meaning the sovereignty of a state lies in the hands of its leaders, and the leaders are able to make decisions based on their own intuition and their own power rather than the rule of law. Whether it's ethnic nationalism, which is an idea some people thought we'd left behind, but apparently we haven't. In the US, we can see a moment when a kind of dual legal system is emerging, where most of us live in a normal rule of law society, but for some people, for immigrants or recent arrivals in the United States, or even in Minneapolis, we saw just anybody with a different color skin. There's a different legal system emerging that treats people in a different way. This is also a very, very old idea. That dual law was an idea that we saw in Germany in the 1930s, and we see that being rediscovered too. So for me, this is a transformative moment with really as much significance as the fall of the Berlin Wall. It's that we're living through a moment of shift in geopolitics, in ideas, in behavior, in our understanding of what the government is. And I'm going to talk about it today from two perspectives. I'm going to talk a little bit about the autocratic world, which is what I described in my book that you just heard described, Autocracy Inc. Then I'm going to talk a bit about the United States, and then I'll finish with some thoughts about what people like you, people who are here in this room, can do. So let me begin with Autocracy Inc. All of us have in our minds a cartoon image of what an autocratic state looks like. There's a bad man at the top, and he controls the police, and the police threaten people with violence, and they're evil collaborators, and maybe there are some brave dissidents. But in the 21st century, that cartoon bears very little resemblance to reality, Because nowadays, autocracies are run not by one bad guy, but by sophisticated networks composed of kleptocratic financial structures, security services, military, police, sometimes paramilitaries, surveillance, and professional propagandists. And the members of these networks are connected not only within a given country, but between countries, sometimes among many countries. And so in practice, what that means is that the corrupt, state-controlled companies in one dictatorship do business with the corrupt, state-controlled or semi-state, semi-private companies in another. And the police in one country can arm and equip and train the police in another, and propagandists can share resources. And this I've documented in my book, so the troll farms created to promote one dictator's propaganda can be switched and changed to promote the propaganda of another. And of course, all of them use common themes, the same messages about the weakness and degeneracy of democracy and the stability of their own systems. Of course, all of them also use shell companies, cryptocurrencies, anonymous trusts, and tax havens to move their money, to hide it around the world, to buy apartments and yachts, because secrecy is a very important part of this new kind of autocracy. And so this is not to say that there is some super secret room where bad guys meet, like in a James Bond movie, and nor does the autocratic alliance have a unifying ideology. So among modern autocrats are people who call themselves communists, nationalists, theocrats, Putinism, Chavismo, North Korean Juche, the Islamic Republic, Chinese communism. All of these groups have different historical roots and different aesthetics, and yet they've been able to make common cause. And no one country leads this group either. So in Washington, people talk a lot about Chinese influence, or they used to do, but what really links the members of this club is a common desire to preserve and enhance their personal power and wealth. And so towards that end, they share a common loathing of independent courts and media. They don't want to have any checks and balances. They don't tolerate legitimate opposition. They don't tolerate any kind of public debate. And so whether they are Chinese or Zimbabwean, they hate or dislike transparency and accountability. And as I said, they prefer secrecy and obfuscation. Again, unlike the political or military alliances of other times and places, the members of this group don't operate like a bloc, but it's much closer to an agglomeration of companies. And this is where I got the expression Autocracy Incorporated or Autocracy Inc. So you have a big group of companies, they each have different business models, but they cooperate when it suits them. And their links are cemented not by ideals, but literally by deals. So whether it's deals designed to take the edge off Western economic boycotts or just to make them personally rich. And this is why they can operate so easily across ideological and geographical and historical lines. So Stalin and Hitler were not primarily interested in money. But the autocrats of the 21st century are all looking for ways to turn state power into personal wealth for themselves and their families, and sometimes a broader entourage. Modern autocrats are also united by their strong sense of impunity, so by the conviction that the views of other nations don't matter, that international law isn't real, and that no court of public opinion or any other kind of court will ever judge them. And in this sense, they also differ from some of their predecessors. So actually, once upon a time, the leaders of the Soviet Union, which was the most powerful autocracy in the second half of the 20th century, cared deeply about how they were perceived around the world. They paid lip service to the aspirational system of norms and treaties that were set up after World War II with the language of universal human rights, laws of war, and the rule of law more generally. For example, some of you might remember, or you read in your history books, remember when the Soviet premier Nikita Khrushchev stood up in the United Nations and banged his shoe, or possibly someone else's shoe, we now think, on the table. It might have been Gromyko's shoe. He famously did this in the General Assembly in 1960. Why did he do that? It was because a Filipino delegate had said that Soviet-occupied Eastern Europe had been deprived of political and civil rights and swallowed up by the Soviet Union, and Khrushchev felt that it was important on the world stage to object. Even in the early part of this century, many, not all, but many dictatorships hid their true intentions behind elaborate, carefully manipulated performances of democracy, and many still do. But more and more often, we see that the members of Autocracy Inc. no longer really care if their countries are criticized or by whom. Some of them, like the leaders of Burma or Zimbabwe, don't really stand for anything beyond self-enrichment, and so they can't really be embarrassed. And the leaders of Iran confidently discount the views of Western infidels. The leaders of China and Russia have spent a decade disputing the human rights language that was long used by international institutions, successfully convincing many people around the world that the treaties and conventions on war and genocide, as well as concepts such as civil liberties or the rule of law, embody Western ideas that don't apply to them. So, impervious to international criticism, many modern autocrats feel no shame about the use of open brutality. So the Burmese junta does not hide the fact that it has murdered hundreds of protesters, including young teenagers, on the streets of Rangoon. The Zimbabwean regime harasses opposition candidates in plain sight during farcical elections. The Chinese government boasts about its destruction of the popular democracy movement in Hong Kong and its so-called anti-extremist campaign, which involved mass arrests and the construction of concentration camps for tens of thousands of Muslim Uyghurs in Xinjiang. The Iranian regime never concealed its violent repression of Iranian women. At the extremes, this kind of contempt can devolve into what the international democracy activist Sergei Popovich has called the Maduro model of governance, after the recently deposed leader of Venezuela. So autocrats who adopt it are willing to see their country enter the category of failed states. This was Sergei's definition, meaning that they will accept economic collapse, endemic violence, mass poverty, and international isolation if that's what it takes to stay in power. So this is what Lukashenko has created in Belarus. It seems to be what the Taliban leadership had in mind when they occupied Kabul. It now looks like this is what Putin is ready to accept for most Russians. So special conditions might still exist for the Russians in Moscow and St. Petersburg, but the rest of the country is sinking into poverty and learning to tolerate the loss of 1,000 dead and wounded Russians every single day. The goal of all these leaders is not to create prosperity or well-being. So none of the things that we had long assumed government was for, to improve the lives of people, to help the poor become wealthier, to spread wealth around, to create a flourishing society, those are not their goals. Their goals are to enrich themselves and their families and to stay in control. But something else unites this group of countries too, because although they don't share a common ideology, and although there are big differences between them, they do have a common enemy. And the enemy is us. So all of us here in this room, all of you who want to live in a liberal democratic society, who study at an open university, all of us who use the language of rights, of the rule of law, all of us who believe that governments should be accountable to their citizens. They dislike us or they hate us because that language, our language, is the same language used by their own internal opposition. So whether it was Alexei Navalny's anti-corruption movement in Russia, whether it was the Hong Kong democracy movement, whether the Iranian protesters, all of these are grassroots movements built by ordinary people who understood that they live in unjust societies where powerful people avoid responsibility for theft and other crimes. And all of them have called for transparency, for justice, for neutral courts, for open debate. And they want these things not because some Americans told them to want them, but because they live in societies where the courts are politicized, where the leadership and its wealth is wrapped in secrecy, and where speech is restricted. In other words, they Just as people in the 18th century and the moment of the origin of our democracy and of other European democracies experienced the unpleasantness or sometimes worse of living in a monarchy or in a one-party state, they too understand that the system could be better and they fight against it. And the leaders of modern autocracies know that this is the case. So every dictator on the planet knows that the language of liberal democracy can inspire their opponents. And that's why they have sought to denigrate it and undermine it, not only in their own countries, but in ours. So China systematically has built institutions designed to buy or influence both popular and elite audiences around the world. The Russians use both open and clandestine propaganda, echoing or amplifying or sometimes learning from the American and European far right, sometimes far left, and adopting it as their own. Islamic fundamentals of different kinds have also sought to recruit followers in our countries as well as theirs. And all of these messages overlap, since all of them seek to build an authoritarian narrative that will challenge the democratic narrative. So the argument that that dictatorship is stable and safe, that democracies are weak and divided, and that they are doomed to what some of them call civilizational failure. So autocracies defend traditional values, hierarchies. Democracies are degenerate, by which they sometimes mean sexually degenerate. I'm sure you all know those arguments and you know where they're going. Let me, though, repeat again that what I'm describing is not a block. It's not. We are not living through a new Cold War. This is not Cold War 2.0. So there is no Berlin Wall that marks a neat geographic divide between democracy and dictatorship. So among the world's harshest dictatorships actually are countries such as the UAE or Vietnam, who are willing to form alliances with the democratic world, or at the very least don't necessarily seek to undermine them as a central part of their foreign policy. At the same time, some democracies, Turkey, Israel, Hungary, India, have elected illiberal leaders whose language and practices often align with the autocratic world. And of course, the divisions run inside countries too. So there are powerful and important democracy movements in Venezuela and Iran. In the past, there was one in Russia before it was brutally repressed. At the same time, there are significant illiberal political movements in Germany, France, Poland, the Netherlands, Italy, Spain. The authoritarian narrative, along with ethnic nationalism and other anti-democratic ideologies, can now be heard across Europe, across Latin America, across the world. And of course, it is now the dominant language of the current administration in the United States. So, in another earlier version of this speech that I might have given 2 or 3 years ago, I would have described the Autocracy Incorporated, and then I would have gone on to speak about how to fight this new network. And I will come back to that at the end. But here's where I think we need to acknowledge what's happening in Washington and around the country right now. Because all of my solutions always involved alliances and coalitions and groups of countries that could ally around specific issues and push back against the allied autocratic world. And in the past, I imagined that the United States could lead some of those coalitions. But the United States, under this administration, and who knows, maybe the next administration, is not interested in leading or even joining democratic coalitions. This administration does not define itself as a leader of any kind of democratic alliance. Instead, Donald Trump has begun to align American foreign and domestic policies with the values and practices of the autocratic world that I've just described. So this dramatic shift is most visible in the new administration's relationships with America's historical allies. From his very first days in office, President Trump attacked and berated Ukraine and Canada and the European Union, placing inexplicably high tariffs on goods coming from those countries, as well as from Japan and South Korea. So we all remember him shouting at the Ukrainian president in the Oval Office. In Europe a few weeks ago, as some of you will know, I lived there part of the time. We've just lived through the momentary expectation that there might be an American invasion of Greenland. And of course, we've heard Trump say that the EU has been created to screw the United States and so on. At the same time, he actually has had relatively few words of criticism for many of the nations I have just described as Autocracy Inc, most notably Russia and China. At the same time, the Trump administration has eliminated or undermined many tools of what used to be American soft power. So programs that were designed to encourage openness or support free press and speech around the world. This includes, we've witnessed the destruction of US aid, whose loss has really been devastating for some of the poorest parts of the world. I was in Sudan last year and saw some of the impact already then. It was in the spring of last year, and there were already small soup kitchens that were able to serve people only 3 days a week instead of 5 days a week. And that was the impact of Elon Musk's decision that US aid should be destroyed. We've also seen an attempt to dismantle the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Asia, as well as America's other broadcasters. And in many cases, this has also been documented, I've also written about this, their programs and channels have been directly replaced by Russian or Chinese equivalents. So the shift against these historically bipartisan institutions, against the belief that Americans should defend and promote democracy around the world, and against democracy itself, is part of something broader. So yes, around the world, Donald Trump appears much happier in the company of dictators than with democratic allies. He was very happy to roll out the red carpet for Vladimir Putin and does not do the same for any of America's historic allies. His administration has recently released a national security strategy that didn't actually mention much about North Korea, referred to China as a kind of trading rival, dismissed Iran as irrelevant, which is ironic given that now we seem to be interested in Iran again, and describes Russia as perhaps a threat to Europe but nothing else. The only real ideological enemy of America named in that document is European liberal democracy. So while America will no longer promote or talk about democracy anywhere in the world, it is American policy to, quote, help Europe correct its current trajectory. Language that implies the US will intervene directly in European politics in order to push Europeans in an illiberal or even autocratic direction, and we've seen some examples of that happening already. So I think there's a deeper goal here, and the goal is to break up the European Union, which is incidentally a goal of the Russian state as well, to weaken and divide Europe so that Europeans are easier to influence, both by Americans and Russians. There may be ideological reasons for this. This is something that's of interest to the most ideological parts of the Trump coalition. And there may be commercial reasons as well that are of interest to the business part of his coalition. It's important to remember that the European Commission is the only regulatory body on the planet that can still fine or otherwise regulate American tech companies. And so no wonder many of these companies now work with the Trump administration, using their power over social media to back anti-European parties and movements as well. So not accidentally, this realignment away from the democratic world has been accompanied by an equally revolutionary shift in official American attitudes to both domestic corruption and foreign kleptocracy. Maybe no one should have been surprised, because actually from the beginning of his career, well before he expressed much interest in politics, Donald Trump was an enthusiastic participant in the opaque offshore world of shell companies and anonymous bank accounts, which is a milieu, as I've already noted, that where the autocratic world thrives. From the 1990s onwards, anonymous investors were an important source of funding for Trump's real estate business, and that was in an era when money from the former Soviet Union, mostly Russia, but not only, was pouring into these opaque property investments. As Trump's son famously acknowledged in 2008, he said, in terms of high-end product influx into the US, Russians make up a pretty disproportionate cross-section of a lot of our assets. So during his first term, Trump dodged or evaded conflict of interest rules that are designed in our system to stop politicians from using political power to enrich themselves. During his second term, he now defies them with what can only be described as brazen insouciance. He's immediately made clear that he and his family will both expand lucrative business relationships with the autocratic world and use their political influence for financial gain at home. Since the election, the Trump organization has announced the construction of a Trump Tower in Saudi Arabia, for example, and there are other Saudi projects. Trump's family also created a cryptocurrency business, World Liberty Financial, that's being used as a vehicle for anyone who wants to anonymously pay money into the president's personal account. The Wall Street Journal a few days ago had a story describing how an Emirati sheikh was using that account to put money into the hands of Trump and his family, and noting that in exchange, the sheikh was allowed to import chips that had been previously prevented from export to the region because of fears that they would be passed on to China. Somehow all those qualms disappeared after this enormous transfer of funds was made. But federal policy has also made a shift inside the United States in favor of opaque business practices and against ordinary Americans. And so we've seen the destruction of institutions designed to protect consumers from sharp financial practices. We've seen the Treasury Department announce that it would no longer pursue anonymous companies or force them to be part of a register, which was a Biden administration plan. Again, the bureau set up to protect consumers from manipulation by banks and other financial institutions was shut down. Trump fired top officials overseeing ethics, whistleblower protections, and labor rights. One of the first things he did after taking office was to fire all of the inspectors generals all across the executive branch. He's deregulated the cryptocurrency industry, which could lead thousands of Americans to lose their money to scammers, but which benefits his donors and maybe his family as well. Indeed, the personal financial interests of Trump and his entourage have begun to shape both American foreign policy as well as domestic policy in ways that have no precedent in contemporary history, or indeed in the history of any modern democracy that I can think of. So from the start, Trump's negotiations with Russia over Ukraine have been dominated not by a desire to create a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, but by a desire to help some American businesses, perhaps including some with ties to the Trump family, profit from the lifting of Russian sanctions. And Trump's involvement with the Middle East, as noted, has already produced lucrative deals for his son, his son-in-law, and others who are close to him. Again, his domestic policies reflect the same reorientation, so away from the rule of law, away from the institutions explicitly designed to promote democracy, and towards the personalization of power. And one of these most important changes has been to the civil service. So since the late 19th century, federal workers in America have been trained to respect the rule of law, to venerate the Constitution, to maintain political neutrality as far as possible, and to uphold lawful policy changes, whether they come from Republican or Democratic administrations. Civil servants are supposed to measure and observe objective reality, for example, evidence of pollution, and to respond accordingly. And the nonpartisan values of this system had long been accepted by everyone. So from Republican voting FBI agents to Democratic voting environmental officers. During their early weeks in office, Trump's team, initially led by DOJ, began mass firing of civil servants and seeking to replace some of them with loyalists chosen not by merit tests, but by purity tests. So already in the first weeks of the administration, at least 2 candidates for higher positions in the FBI were told to state who the real patriots were on January the 6th, 2021. So they were asked, in other words, not just to demonstrate their loyalty to the Constitution or even their loyalty to Trump, but they were also asked to repeat outright falsehoods. So violating the old civil service ethos, which required people, as I said, to make decisions based on objective reality and not on myths or fictions. The impact of this change, I live in Washington, and so I see it all around me, my next door neighbor and people who I've known or friends of friends, and I see that the impact of this change has been rapid and quite harsh. So suddenly, and not accidentally, a lot of people who worked for the American federal government had the same experience as people who find themselves living under foreign occupation. I found it very useful to reread. There's a famous book about the early days of Polish communism called Captive Minds. And it's just about how people behave when a different power comes in to take control, and how some people adjust and some people can't take it and some people quit and some people collaborate. And you hear very similar stories now from the Washington bureaucracy as well. In the spring of 2025, I got a letter from a woman who had worked for much of her career at major universities. She was a government scientist as well as for the federal government. And she'd read an article that I had written about the experience of living through regime change, and she found that it touched a chord. So she said, quote, "Will soon face a choice about whether to allow myself to get fired, to resign, or to be considered complicit in the current regime." This is her language, not mine, government scientist. These are not choices that Americans are used to making, but of course they would sound very, very familiar to the inhabitants of the autocratic world. So too would Trump's use of lawsuits to intimidate media, or his attempts to browbeat Republican congressmen and senators using financial threats to their future campaigns, promises to fund their opponents if they don't toe the line. Or the selective targeting of foreign students, some of whom were picked up off the street by plainclothes officers, or the deportation without due process of immigrants, including some with legal status who had committed no crimes, to prisons in El Salvador. Or, as we've all seen in the past few weeks, the use of brutal and almost certainly illegal tactics against protesters in Minneapolis, which included the cold-blooded murder of 2 of them. Put all these changes together, and there is a pattern. So we see a personalized, even patrimonial foreign policy, one that is designed not to benefit America's allies or even America itself, but rather to benefit the American president, his friends, and his family. So a political system that rewards people for loyalty, but not for merit, a drumbeat of propaganda directed against judges, journalists, whistleblowers, anyone who stands in the way of the regime, attempts to shape the midterm elections before they happen through gerrymandering. For the first time, we've had the federal government attempt to impose gerrymandering on states or pressure states to change their electoral districts out of turn, through making it difficult for some people to vote, and perhaps we'll see through the use of ICE to intimidate voters on election day. That's just a suspicion, but it's been one that's been voiced by the governor of Illinois, governor of California, and others. So for the first time also in history, the federal government has demanded that several states hand over their voter rolls. In other words, they give information about voters to the government, to Washington, part of what seems to be a plan to look through them and kick people off them. So these are recognizable kinds of behavior. These are ways of behavior that we know from the states that comprise Autocracy Inc. And they now describe the political system that the Trump administration is trying to build in the United States. That does not mean that they will succeed or that they have succeeded. On the contrary, they have received pushback from the courts, from voters, from state politicians, and belatedly even from some of their own party in Congress. But it is clear that this is their goal. It's very important to separate, not to speak about America as a dictatorship right now. Clearly it's not, or I wouldn't be here. But this is, the goal is to build a one-party state, one in which it will, at the very least, be very difficult for the ruling party to lose an election. And as a reminder to those who think that democracies usually fall because of a coup d'etat or tanks in the street or some colonel, shooting up the chandelier in the president's palace. Actually, most democracies fall because an elected president or an elected leader then uses his power to take over the institutions of the state and create an unfair system. That is how, in the modern world, most democracies change their, cease to be real. And there is a pattern to that. We know what it looks like. It's happened in other places. And it looks like this is what the Trump administration is trying to achieve. So where does that leave us? Here, again, us means Americans, but it also means people here in this room. So you're here at a major university, at a lecture sponsored by the history department. There are people in this room who are professional students of history and literature, people who want to live in an open society and plan their lives and careers around teaching and thinking and learning in an open way. People like Eugene Lun, who did that all of his life, or your professors here today. So how do people like you, us, how do we rebuild the coalitions that we will need to counter the propaganda and the power of the autocratic world, and to counter the propaganda and the power of those in the current administration, maybe not everybody, who seek to corrupt our political system? So the first and most obvious thing to do is to recognize reality. So I think that Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, was correct when he said a few weeks ago at Davos that the current international shift is not a transition, but a rupture. So he said, he spoke of this moment not as something, a gradual change, but one that is immediate. And I think it's important to recognize what he said as true. In other words, there is no liberal world order anymore, not even an aspirational one. There are no rules of international politics, and even in our domestic politics, the rules are only as powerful as the people who are dedicated to enforcing them. And so shouting about them being broken is a pointless task if that's all we're doing. So instead, people who believe not just in democracy, but in the liberal institutions and values and principles that you need to underlie democracy to make it work, need to reimagine and reinvent politics to meet the moment. And here's where, if the leaders of the autocratic world are able to work together, to cooperate with one another, if they can help one another suppress internal opposition or teach one another how to use surveillance technology, then why can't the democratic world also work together to push back against them? So by democratic world here, I mean something very specific. So not just democratic governments, but the democratic opposition in Russia, Hong Kong, Iran, indeed the US. For too long, we've seen each one of those struggles as unique, which of course in some ways they always are, but they're also, all these are connected maybe more deeply than ever before in that they face common threats. I saw this most clearly in Minneapolis. Now, I didn't go there, but I have colleagues who went, and I put together a podcast that included some people who were testifying from Minneapolis, or who's my producer of the podcast is from there. She went there and she spoke to people who were involved in protests there. And I have to say, the way they talked about evading surveillance, the use of pseudonyms inside what isn't really a movement, it's just neighbors really working together some of the time. The way they talked about volunteers moving in and out, people came who could help for a while and then they walked away. The way they learned to evade facial recognition or to recognize that they needed to do so. The way they tried to liaise with the press, with political leaders, all of this reminded me a lot of it's funny, it reminded me of 2014 in Ukraine, which is the Maidan movement, which operated in a similar way. It reminded my colleague of the Arab Spring. It could also be like the Hong Kong democracy movement. You could also see people learning to move around the city, to react in different ways, not to have a leaderless movement that wasn't so easy to identify who was running it and to target them, to identify them, or to smear them. So, we're already at a place where at least some Americans are already learning lessons from how protest at least works in the autocratic world. And once we recognize that, and once we understand that some things are the same, then the faster, as I said, we can move on to thinking about what to do next. But the second thing I think is also to identify some specific projects in front of this. And here the list could be very long, from economic projects to tech projects and so on. And I'm just going to say two things. To my mind, this is to all the students here. One of the most important tasks in front of us is the reinvention of the public sphere, which in America, our national conversation is now governed entirely by rules not designed to increase or facilitate democracy or even good conversation. It's not even about democracy, it's about normal debate. But instead the rules are set by a few for-profit companies in service of their own interests. So instead of, say, the procedural regulations that would guide a real-life town meeting, or the unspoken rules that govern a conversation like this one, after I speak, we're going to take questions, and there will be, I hope, civilized exchange. But instead of that, the actual online conversation is ruled by algorithms that are designed to capture attention, to harvest data, and to sell advertising. And so the voices of the angriest and the most emotional and the most divisive and sometimes the most duplicitous participants are amplified. And reasonable and rational and nuanced voices are much harder to hear. And that means that radicalization spreads more quickly, and Americans feel more powerless in the face of this public sphere because they are. They don't control their own data. They don't control the algorithms that dictate what it is that they see. Now, we know that alternatives are possible because we used to have them. Before private commercial platforms definitively took over, online public interest projects did flourish online, and it's still possible to imagine, for example, social media sites designed deliberately in the public interest that can promote civil discourse and not merely absorb your attention and your data. It's possible to imagine dynamic forms of regulation that give people control over their own algorithms. I know the European Union is looking at some of that right now. And right now there are researchers all over the world who understand, as well as public officials and politicians who understand how damaging the current system is. Why shouldn't they work together to bring about change? Great subject for an undergraduate thesis. So I give it to you. A different coalition could also, if there were the will to do it, put an end to this world of secret money. It exists thanks to regulation, and it could be abolished by different regulations. Citizens United could be defeated by the right acts of Congress. US states, along with their counterparts around the world, could immediately make all ownership transparent. Quite a few US states, I think not California, but South Dakota, Wyoming, as well as Delaware and others, have laws that make possible secret trusts and secret bank accounts, and they could simply decide not to do that anymore. Tax havens could be delegalized. Really the only people who need to keep their houses and businesses and income secret, after all, are people who are either stealing or they're tax cheats. And we need a coalition of countries who want to enforce money laundering laws, stop selling security and surveillance technology to autocrats, and apply transparency laws broadly. And so you could imagine a world in which we includes parts of Europe, Canada, partners in Asia, Latin America, and that will require a lot of vigorous diplomacy, the engagement of citizens, maybe the engagement of academics who could interest themselves in this problem, and perhaps someday it will again include the US government as well. Finally, there are acts of individual engagement. I am often asked in fora like this one, what can I do? And the answer the more I think about it, the answer is that there isn't a single answer, because the answer depends on who you are and what job you have, what talents you have, what interests you have. You know, if you are a lawyer, there are now a dozen or more organizations who are involved in lawsuits, in pro bono work, defending people who have been victims of this rapid change of politics. There are plenty of opportunities to get involved. I have a family relative who's a law student who does this in his spare time. There's now something called an externship, where you can live somewhere else and work online for on behalf. There's quite a lot of that work going on, and there's plenty of scope for you to do it. If you're a doctor, you know, clearly right now what you should be doing is informing your patients about the reality of vaccines, about the reality of health. You should be thinking about how to communicate those ideas. Maybe you need to have an Instagram account if you never thought you needed that, but maybe you do. You should be thinking about how can you begin to communicate better health information in order to defeat the disinformation that now comes from the federal government. If you're a professor, well, you're here, and you have a responsibility to teach real history to your students and not propaganda. I mean, I don't think I have to say that to this room, but just in case you know anybody who wants to teach propaganda, not history, you can try and talk them out of it. There's also, the question of involvement in public life or civic life. I mean, for a lot of people, it seems like an impossible, mountain to climb. How do I get involved in elections or politics? And the answer is you just do it. You show up at a meeting, you see where you could be useful, you could lick some envelopes, or you could do some door-to-door campaigning for somebody. And as you get into it, as you learn how the system works, then you get better at it and you figure out what you can do where you're most useful. Maybe you could run for office, and I don't mean you have to run for president, but you could be, everybody needs a good county treasurer, and we need a lot of small-town mayors. We've had for a long time in this country a very pernicious idea that politicians are somehow a professional separate class. And there are people who do politics, and they're over there, and they do politics, and we don't really have to be engaged with them because they have, they were weird kids in high school or something, and this is what they want to do. But actually, the point of being in a democracy is that you can be involved at any level if you want. No one is stopping you. And that more people don't do it is part of our problem now. And this is, it's also a question of attitude. I think for a long time, for Americans, because we were so successful for so long, we failed at many things, but our democracy felt stable and successful, and that meant that people treated it a little bit like tap water. It was just this thing that came out of the wall. And you didn't have to think about where the water came from. You turn it on and you don't really know what reservoir it's from. It's just there, and that's what democracy was like. But actually, in reality, democracy is often something that you have to, it's more like water in a well. Like you have to go and get it. You might find in a time of emergency, the tap has been cut off. And so you might have to involve yourself in thinking about where it comes from, what you can do to get it, how you can retrieve it. And let me just finish with that idea, and that is simply to take democracy and civic engagement seriously, because aside from whatever else you do, whatever job you have, you are also a citizen. And so you too have a right to learn about it, to teach it, to debate it, to improve it, and defend it. Maybe there is no natural liberal world order anymore, but there are liberal societies. There are open and free countries that offer a better chance, at least, for people to live useful lives than closed dictatorships do. They are hardly perfect. Our own is in deep trouble. But really, that's all the more reason to protect and defend them. There have been very few of them that have existed across human history. Many have existed for a time and then failed. They can be destroyed from the outside, but more often they collapse from the inside. They're torn apart by demagogues, by bad faith, by bad economic decisions. But that means that all of us can, if we care about them, play a role in defending them. I will stop there. Thank you very much.